The race for the White House heats up as Democrats compete in South Carolina for the right to face U.S. President Donald Trump. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Caleb, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. A Fox News poll released on Thursday showed about two-thirds of Democrats believe that Senator Bernie Sanders could beat President Trump in November's U.S. presidential election. Sanders has the highest share of any candidate in the field, but he is expected to finish behind Joe Biden in Saturday's South Carolina primary. Polls show the former vice president could not only win South Carolina, but perhaps win it big, mere days ahead of Super Tuesday. What does it all mean? We will put that question to CGTN's Nathan King. He is in Columbia, South Carolina, in the Palmetto State. So, Nathan, break it down. Who's up, who's down, and what can we expect out of South Carolina?
Sean, I don't need to tell you about South Carolina. I know you've covered this state and the area as well. It's very important because essentially this primary is the first of the southern primaries. It's also, as you just said, the first real test of African-American support for the candidates. And the African-American vote, of course, makes up the backbone of the Democratic primary process. Now, Joe Biden, the vice president, has staked his candidacy on winning here. He says he's the best place to beat Donald Trump, but he hasn't got any victories yet. In fact, Bernie Sanders, as you said, at the top there, has won the popular vote in Iowa. He won in New Hampshire. He won in Nevada. But the polls we've seen in the last 24 hours actually are giving Joe Biden a big boost. Where he was about 3 months ago, sometimes double digits we're seeing, even maybe 20% ahead. Now, take that with a pinch of salt, but if Joe Biden wins here, that is very big for the former vice president because it sort of puts a block in the way of Bernie Sanders. The big question, though, is if any candidate reaches 15% of the vote, because that's where you get delegates to take to the convention in Milwaukee later on this year, and a lot of candidates are going to fall below that. So essentially, at the moment, it's a two-horse race between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. He is putting a lot of effort in here to try and rack up another win as well. But there are other candidates that may act as spoilers. We talk about Mike Bloomberg. There's Tom Steyer, of course, the other billionaire in the race. So it's very exciting going into voting, what, in about 12 hours or so?
Exactly. And momentum, we hear that word a lot in politics. Super Tuesday, March 3rd, that's next week, and there are 1,357 delegates at stake. How important is winning in South Carolina ahead of that vote? And do you think Biden is going to kind of rise a bit with this momentum?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point because South Carolina is truly a much more representative state when it comes to the electorate as a whole and especially for the Democratic primary. And you mentioned those plus 1,300 delegates. To win a majority and essentially become the party's nominee automatically, you need 1,991. And that is why Super Tuesday is going to be so important. But the momentum coming out of South Carolina is going to be all important. If Joe Biden, the vice president under Barack Obama, gets the African-American vote in this state, as you said, 60% up to two-thirds, then that will basically suggest that he could be a potential front runner across the country. Would that translate into more votes on Tuesday? Bernie Sanders, though, remember, has a lot of energy among young voters, untested part of the Democratic Party. And then there are all the other candidates that if they poll below 50%, maybe they will pull out. Not necessarily before Super Tuesday, but sometime after, clearing the field for potentially Bernie Sanders getting a majority of the votes. If not, it could go all the way to the convention. And we are hearing from Democratic sources, you've seen the press articles as well, that if no one gets a majority, we could actually see a fight on the floor of the Democratic convention in Milwaukee and all sort of backroom deals. Of course, that's not great for the sort of democratic process, but those are the rules. So everything to fight for here. It's quite a dramatic race, and it reminds me very much of the Republican race for the nomination when Donald Trump secured the nomination back in 2016. Doesn't it feel a bit like that to you?
It does feel a bit like that, and it's interesting because a lot of top Democrats are talking about having an open convention this year. So, Nathan, thank you very much, and we will, of course, check in with you later. Good luck working down there tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
And that's CGTN's Nathan King reporting from South Carolina. There is a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Amy Holmes is in New York. She's a political commentator and columnist. Niambi Carter is an assistant professor of political science at Howard University and the author of American While Black, African Americans, Immigration, and the Limits of Citizenship. In New York, Aaron Matei hosts Pushback with Aaron Matei and writes for The Nation magazine. Also with us here in Washington, veteran political journalist and analyst, Steve Chigueras. Thank you all for being here. Steve, I want to start with you. You heard Nathan talk about Biden hopes to win and win big. Polls are out there. Let's twist that a bit. If he doesn't win big, if he wins by 3, 4, 5%, is this in some ways a loss for him? And what are you looking for coming out of this heading into Super Tuesday?
Well, I'd argue that nobody has more at stake tomorrow than Joe Biden. This is a guy who's argued for the last almost year that he's been in this race that he's the most electable candidate. He has not been able to win to this point. He has now pointed to South Carolina because of his longtime support from African-American voters there, that he will win in South Carolina. He said at the debate this week, I will win South Carolina. So if he doesn't win South Carolina, sort of breaking that promise, and it's not a good look for him. Now, if he wins, how big is the victory? If he ekes out a victory over Bernie Sanders, that's not going to give the anti-Sanders wing of the Democratic Party much confidence that Joe Biden can be the guy to run the table on Super Tuesday and beyond. But if he wins big, double digits or more, 20, 30 points, which would be an unbelievable win, then perhaps the folks in the Democratic Party who aren't fans of Bernie Sanders could say, wait a minute, maybe we can coalesce around another candidate here, Joe Biden, and perhaps that lifts him as he goes into Super Tuesday and beyond.
Which is going to be important. And Niambi, let's talk about the African-American vote, because if you get the support of Congressman James Clyburn, that's going to be significant. I want to play you his emotional way he came out and offered his support for Joe Biden.
Our challenge is making the greatness of this country accessible and affordable for all. If it's health care, is it accessible? Is it affordable? Education, is it accessible? Is it affordable? Housing, energy, making it accessible and affordable. And nobody with whom I've ever worked in public life is any more committed to that motto, that pledge that I have to my constituents than Joe Biden.
Boy, you really get the sense of a heartfelt endorsement. I want to know how significant that is, not just in South Carolina, but beyond, and how much weight is this going to carry, especially in the South, where a lot of Southern voters of all races are looking to someone to lead them on to defeat Trump.
Well, I mean, I think this is huge. I mean, Jim Clyburn doesn't just hand out these kinds of endorsements often. I think the fact that he held it right close to the race is also another reason we see these bumps in poll numbers for Joe Biden. But I think it speaks to something else, which is he understands his state. I think he thinks about sort of what are older voters seeing that perhaps younger voters who are sort of hypnotized by Bernie Sanders are not seeing. And I think he thinks about this as a pragmatic choice. So it's not just that Black people should just choose whomever. It's who is going to be the best person for us and who's going to do the least harm. So it's not that they couldn't be interested in a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or these other folks, but this is a person I know, this is a person I trust, this is a person who has relationships that actually matter in Washington, and I think he's going to be the best guy. So I think Clyburn was very strategic in thinking about that, and I think South Carolina voters will also be very strategic when they're thinking about that. You're talking about a state where many of the voters are over 45, so they're very different than, say, the Sanders coalition.
Aaron, I want to get to you because we heard Niambi talk about the best person for us. A new poll out shows that Sanders may be overtaking Biden in terms of African-American support. What do you make of all this?
I'm not Black, so I don't want to speak for the Black vote, but I do want to say that although Clyburn's endorsement was very critical, it was striking to see another speech this week from a prominent Black leader, which is the Reverend Al Sharpton, where he appeared with Senator Bernie Sanders. And the Reverend Al renounced the red baiting that has been going on against Bernie Sanders, trying to attack him for his previous praise of Fidel Castro's literacy programs in Cuba and this whole manufactured controversy about Russia supposedly favoring him. And the Reverend Al pointed out that Dr. King, back in the 1960s, faced similar accusations. He was accused of being a communist, of working with the Soviet Union, and all of that was a deliberate smear campaign to try to undermine Dr. King's social justice message. And I think the import of what the Reverend Al said is that Bernie Sanders' foes are trying to do the same thing today, and it was very brave of him and very poignant for him to call that out.
Yeah, I think that I could have phrased that better. I just meant as a political analyst, what are you hearing from black voters? And Nyambi, I want to talk with you. Pick up on what Aaron said, and do you think that African-American voters are really going to passionately support Biden, or because unity has not been the characteristic of this race so far?
Well, I mean, I think black people will show up because they've shown that they will show up for whoever's at the top of the ticket. But I will say about South Carolina specifically, Reverend Al Sharpton is not from South Carolina. He's a New Yorker. So I think he's right that, you know, it means something to say that these kinds of smears against Bernie Sanders are wrong-headed and are part of a tradition of black organizers who face similar charges. But Reverend Al Sharpton is not from South Carolina. Moreover, I also think it's important to note that this is CIAA weekend. And most people probably don't know what that means, but that's an athletic competition of HBCUs. So if Bernie Sanders supporters are young people, they can't vote early and they can't write in, but they can go to Charlotte and go to this basketball tournament, which sees over almost 190,000 people over the course of the week. Mm-hmm. I think it does matter. It is of consequence for how Bernie Sanders is going to shake out in South Carolina.
Steve, you want to jump in?
I also think it's worth pointing out, by the way, that Tom Steyer, who has spent millions and millions of dollars on advertising across the country, but especially in South Carolina, has siphoned some African-American support, at least in some recent polls. And so Biden has to worry about splitting the African-American vote with Tom Steyer, somebody who is really not registering in other states moving forward, and that could be a problem for Biden tomorrow.
Amy, you may be feeling a little bit lonely out there. Sorry we didn't get to you earlier. But kind of jump in. I want to get your take first. A couple of questions for you. Firstly, tell me what your reaction is to what people are saying about Sanders versus Biden. Is Sanders chipping away at what Biden perceives as if not a lock on the African-American vote, certainly a very solid block for him?
Well, Sean, I think all the guests are making excellent points, but let's be clear. Tomorrow, Joe Biden needs to crush it in South Carolina. He has banked his entire candidacy on the South Carolina win. He can't just win by a little. He needs to win by a lot. But something that I've been observing through the Democratic primary process that I think is really interesting is that the African-American vote has not been locked in to the quote-unquote establishment candidate who seemed to be Joe Biden in the beginning. We've seen his support among African-Americans erode, and we just heard Steve mention that Tom Steyer, by pouring his time and energy into South Carolina, has been able to gain African-American support. I would also point out that it's interesting, at least in South Carolina, that African-American voters there are not necessarily, they don't necessarily love woke politics. We saw a lot of that in the early Democratic primary race, and let's face it, two of the black Democratic candidates, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, they're no longer competing, and they weren't even getting into double digits with African-American voters. So as Nyambi was pointing out, South Carolina African-American voters tend to be older. And as Jim Clyburn pointed out this weekend on ABC News, he said, look, Bernie Sanders' socialism doesn't necessarily register with the 60% African-American vote in South Carolina. He sees it as a drag, and that African-American voters actually tend to be on the conservative side of the Democratic Party.
I think it's going to be interesting, Amy, from an international perspective. So many people watching the way this race is unfolding and hearing that Sanders is running basically on a socialist platform. That's what's being reported. I'm not voicing my thoughts one way or another. But when you are king at the top of the heap right now, you take the most shots. Let's look at what happened this past week in the big debate. And even though he took a lot of shots, he can give as well as he gets.
Vladimir Putin thinks that Donald Trump should be president of the United States, and that's why Russia is helping you get elected, so
Mr.
you'll
Bloomberg.
lose to him.
I'll tell you what the Russians want. They don't have a political party. They want chaos. and chaos is what is coming our way. I mean, look, if you think the last 4 years has been chaotic, divisive, toxic, exhausting, imagine spending the better part of 2020 with Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump.
I'm hearing my name mentioned a little bit tonight. I wonder why. And maybe, you know, Pete mentions what the American people want. I will tell you, Pete, what the American people want, and Joe, what the American people want. They don't want candidates to be running to billionaires for huge amounts of funding.
All right, let's clear this up once and for all.
Pete has gotten funding
you've got people
from
believing
over
something that is
50
false.
billionaires.
Politics, you got to love it. Amy, I wanted to ask you, the intelligence community in the U.S. is basically saying that Russia is, again, trying to help Donald Trump and also trying to push Bernie Sanders. What do you make of all of this?
Mayor Bloomberg tried to land this very convoluted argument in the debate this week. It didn't land, and I don't think voters are paying any attention to that. If you ask what do voters want ideas, they want leadership, they want somebody who connects with them, kitchen table issues. You know, how is that candidate really speaking to them? So trying to drag out the Russian, boogeyman from, out from under the bed, I don't think is a great strategy, and it certainly doesn't speak to the American voter.
Aaron, I see you nodding your head back there. You want to chime in on this?
I totally agree. To me, this line about Russia wants X, Russia wants Trump, or Russia wants Sanders, to me, it's the intellectual and factual equivalent of saying, as we do as children, that, you have cooties. There's no actual evidence for it. It's basically a tool of people in power who want to smear anyone they don't like as being a Russian asset. There's no actual evidence presented as to why the U.S. intelligence community, quote unquote, thinks that Vladimir Putin wants to elect Bernie Sanders, because this isn't about evidence. This is a playbook that we've seen now for more than 3 years, where the specter of the Russian boogeyman, as Amy says, is constantly conjured, and I totally agree. It just does not work, and that's why Bernie Sanders, despite all the attempts to bring him down, is still at the top of the polls.
Yeah, and let's face it, American voters are not going to the poll, looking down the list and saying, I need to vote for the guy that Russia doesn't want. They want to vote for the person who actually, speaks to them and has a message that they agree with.
Amy, fair enough. But as someone here in D.C. that's covered this a lot, there is a lot behind what went on in 2016. Don't you think so, Steve? And shouldn't the United States be more concerned about what could happen in 2020?
Well, yes, of course. There's evidence that Russia meddled in the 2016 election. There's no evidence that any candidate benefited definitively from that meddling. But we know the intelligence has shown that there is meddling, and they're saying now there's going to be meddling in 2020. But to suggest that voters are going to buy a political argument and say, well, I believe personally that I'm going to be influenced by Russia. No voter is saying that, and it's just not an argument that's going to land when a politician is making that argument.
And I don't think this will matter at all to Bernie Sanders supporters. In fact, it might make them more strident because it does it's coming from a person that they don't trust. Michael Bloomberg is the billionaire, right? He's the guy who Bernie Sanders has labeled as attempting to buy an election. So I don't think the messenger will change anything, and I certainly don't think the message will change anything. This is not going to be something that people are going to be bothered by, and certainly it didn't bother Donald Trump supporters in 2016 when these kinds of conversations were had.
We've gone about 18 minutes and we haven't talked about Michael Bloomberg a lot to this point, which I'm sure will break his heart. But I want to talk about Super Tuesday.
$500 million later, we need to talk about it.
We'll get there. I want to talk about Super Tuesday and where we're going, but we have to focus on what happened this week in the United States and globally. Financial markets simply tanking. And while most are blaming in large part the spread of COVID-19 for dragging the markets down, Donald Trump has taken a different take on this, also blaming Democrats, first for fear-mongering, secondly for saying that voters are terrified that a Democrat could wind up in the White House in 2020. Here's what he had to say.
I think the financial markets are very upset when they look at the Democrat candidate standing on that stage making fools out of themselves, and they say, if we ever have a president like this, and there's always a possibility. It's an election. Who knows what happens, right? I think we're going to win. I think we're going to win by a lot. But when they look at the statements made by the people standing behind those podiums, I think that has a huge effect, yeah.
Amy, this seems to kind of sort of mirror what people have criticized Trump for, deflect and deny. Do you think what he says is holding up? Do you think that it's a fair argument?
Well, I'm not a stock market analyst, so I can't get into those details. I don't think it holds up. In fact, I think the problem is coronavirus, and stock markets don't like uncertainty, and we're getting, more and more dire reports. It was just reported today that 14% of patients in China in a certain province had been infected, thought to be cured, and it turned out they were reinfected. I think that really rattles the stock market, and that's really what it's about. But let's face it, both sides, both parties are going to try to score points wherever they can, including Donald Trump and the Democratic Party.
Do you think it's fair criticism? I mean, I'm not asking you to take a look at the markets, but Donald Trump has this ability to just, if anybody tries to lay a glove on him, he's almost like Teflon. He can deflect it and put it right back on the opposition.
Well, he's had a lot of time doing this, right? He's a reality TV star. He understands the media. He understands what resonates with people. But I will say this. I think it's interesting that he put Mike Pence in charge of this effort to contain this. I mean, this guy oversaw a public health crisis in the state of Indiana. I think this looked like a Surgeon General's job. So I think that this is just not credible. And I don't know that anybody who's a Democrat or a Democrat leaner would care anything about what Donald Trump had to say about this particular moment. And he does what he always does.
I want to ask you, Steve, do you think the coronavirus could be a campaign issue moving forward if it comes to the U.S., if there is an outbreak, and if Pence doesn't step up to the plate?
It just depends what the fallout of the coronavirus is. I mean, look, if this turns out to be not a big deal in this country, then there won't be much of a fallout. If it turns out that the economy takes a huge hit, if it turns out that a lot of people get really sick and a lot of Americans die because of this, and the president's comments this week of sort of flippantly saying this is going to go away pretty soon. I mean, it almost echoes what George W. Bush did during Hurricane Katrina, saying, hey, you guys did a heck of a job when FEMA didn't do a heck of a job. Right. This could be a moment for the president where, this is his first real national crisis, and if he looks like he didn't take it seriously, that could have lingering effects.
Or had missteps. Aaron, I want to ask you, because Trump wanted to cut the CDC budget by 16%. Congress stepped in. That didn't happen. But everything that Steve says could hold true. His first big, potentially national crisis. What should we look for, and what do you expect the Democrats could pounce on?
It's true. I think we should be cautious of partisan exploitation on all sides. But we have to focus on what we do know. We do know about Trump's attempted cuts, as you talk about. Trump has dismissed some key officials handling issues like this from the National Security Council. That was the work of John Bolton, among his many awful achievements. And then there's the fact that all sides have come together to support sanctions on places like Iran. So it's Trump who generated these sanctions, but it was Democrats, everybody but Bernie Sanders, who signed on to them. And one impact of this, Iran is warning, and health officials have backed this up, that Iran has been unable to import the test kits that it needed to test for the virus. And we don't know if that has contributed to the death toll there, whatever it is in Iran, because that's very opaque. But it does underscore to me that this bipartisan consensus, driven by Trump, but still with the support of Democrats, behind sanctions against beleaguered governments, can be deadly and can hurt people in ways that we can't foresee.
We have a lot to talk about, and we only have...
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo came out today, and he said that the United States does want to assist Iran, and that there are not sanctions when it comes to, health care being sent to Iranians.
Right. After the damage was done. After Iran was not able to import the test kits that it needed. It's better late than never, but it should still be pointed out.
Amy, I want to ask you about Super Tuesday. Let's talk about who drops out, who can move on. Mike Bloomberg, $500 million. Will he be here on March 4th?
Well, we'll see. It's a $500 million, gamble that Michael Bloomberg has made, that he's going to, stake his claim on Super Tuesday. He's been running national ads. He's been, trying to reach voters in that way. I think it's risky. But when you talk about this very fractured field, when I look at it, a lot of these candidates, they're doing okay, pretty well. Amy Klobuchar, she had a bump. A lot of them, they're incentivized to try to get as many delegates as possible going into the convention to possibly be a VP candidate on the ticket. Yeah. So to push these people out, I think it's going to happen when their money runs out, when their funders tell them, no more plane flights, no more hotels, your campaign is over.
Steve, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, Bloomberg got in this race because he thinks that people like Biden, Buttigieg, Warren aren't going to be the nominee versus Bernie Sanders, and he needs to be the savior of all of this. And then what we've seen is, as Amy said, he spent $500 million, and his numbers have sort of plateaued now since he's been on stage actually speaking to voters and not having his ads do the talking for him. And so we'll see how he does on Super Tuesday, and we'll see if he thinks whatever his performance is on Super Tuesday, whether that's worth continuing on fighting against what could be a muddled anti-Sanders group of people. Now, the one person I would really look at on Super Tuesday is Elizabeth Warren. There's a Massachusetts primary. She's the senator from Massachusetts, and there was a poll out this week that showed her actually in second place in Massachusetts. And I can't imagine that if she doesn't win her home state on Super Tuesday, that the money isn't just going to dry up for her afterwards, and that there's really going to be an argument for her to stay in this race. She's got to win in Massachusetts.
What do you think we should look for?
I think we're going to see how Joe Biden does in these other contests as well. I mean, this is the first time we get to see Michael Bloomberg. I think the fact that he's a story and he hasn't competed in anything yet is probably why most people don't feel a lot of things for him. But also, he'll still have $59.5 billion when all this is over with. So I can't cry for him. But I would like to see how Joe Biden does. He's just racked up another endorsement from Tim Kaine in Virginia. I think that'll be important. I mean, there's still North Carolina at play. So I think I want to see how Joe Biden does. And I agree that Elizabeth Warren, if she can't bring her home state to her, then that doesn't bode well. But she still has a lot of passion and a lot of supporters. So,
Aaron, we got about 35 seconds. Give me your last take.
I think Bloomberg got into this race to stop Bernie Sanders, and I think so far he's having the opposite effect. He's drawing some votes away from the other so-called moderate candidates, and he's providing a really great contrast to Sanders. I mean, Sanders is someone talking about health care for all, helping the working class. Michael Bloomberg is a Republican who went to the Republican National Convention in 2004 and urged people to vote to re-elect George W. Bush. So I think Bloomberg being in the race helps Sanders. I don't think he stays if he doesn't do well, because stopping Sanders is his main goal. And then we have to see whether or not Sanders gets the majority, because if he doesn't, superdelegates have made very clear that they want to stop him with their vote.
Aaron,
one last word.
I'm sorry, we are completely out of time, Amy. I apologize, but we'll have you back. There's lots to talk about. This isn't going away. And that does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Calebs here in Washington, D.C. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and I'd like to thank our panel as well.
Hello everybody, I'm Anand Naidu. If you enjoy the thoughtful, engaged discussions you see on The Heat, you may also want to subscribe to our podcast. It's appropriately titled The Heat. Twice a week we take a deep dive on world headlines, talking to experts, journalists and others. It's a fresh, focused and intimate look at the issues that matter most. Whether it's the Hong Kong riots, the latest Middle East conflict or US politics, the Heat podcast gives the clear context needed to understand both what's going on and why. And what's best, we come to you. Whether you're at home or on the go, you can find the Heat podcast just about anywhere podcasts are found. Just search the Heat CGTN. Have a listen today and subscribe. Thanks.